Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Commons in Conversation, a new series the Chronicle is launching as part of our work to put the focus on the ways nonprofits and philanthropy can close the nation's many divides, not just politics, but race, gender, geography, generation, and so much more. When we were designing these conversations, we knew we wanted to start it off with a philanthropist who has been successful in advancing bipartisan solutions to policy, and that's no easy feat. That's even more necessary today when we have the 50-50 divide we're likely to see in the fall's elections. The work of Arnold Ventures immediately came to mind, and we're so pleased that Laura Arnold is able to join us today. Laura, welcome to this conversation.
Well, Stacy, thank you so much for having me, and more importantly, for uh, starting this space of the commons and encouraging others to think about these issues of how we can create a better society for all of us, and how to decrease polarization and make the country better. So I'm honored to be part of that conversation, and of course, I'm thrilled and honored to be here with you.
Well, a lot of people in philanthropy know the Arnolds well. Let me just remind you a little bit about their giving. They are among the nation's most generous philanthropists. They've signed the Giving Pledge. They've also committed to give at least 5% of their wealth away every year, really focusing on the giving while living philosophy. And so that means that they're doing a lot of work in many areas of interest to our audience. They focus on education, infrastructure, so many different kinds of things, and we'll talk about many of those kinds of things today. Laura, I'm curious as we look at the way things have changed since you got into philanthropy. I think you've been working seriously at it for about 14 years. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about how you see the issue of the nation's divide changing? How has it affected you as a philanthropist in the work that you're trying to get done? Is it indeed intensifying? And does dealing with this issue have to become a necessary preoccupation for everybody in philanthropy?
Well, thank you for that question. We've been engaged in philanthropy in some way, shape, or form for many years. Arnold Ventures now, and for the last 10 plus years, has really been a policy organization, meaning that our objective is to help people through better laws. And the spectrum, the trajectory of change for us is identifying a problem, creating better alternatives that are evidence-based to solving that problem, scaling those solutions where appropriate, testing them, and when solutions are proven, transforming them into policy. So necessarily a political environment that is quote unquote polarized informs that trajectory of change, and it affects behavior in some way. So there's the policy world, I would say, and then there's also the philanthropy world. And I would say so. I'll start with the philanthropy world, and I think for me the greatest takeaway in the last 10 years or so is that the space in philanthropy, on one hand, has become much more data driven because many more actors are entering that are focused on data. There are many young people who have who have found success early on in life, people who are much more focused on sort of numbers and deliverables, et cetera. So from that perspective, I think the evidence piece has been really terrific. I think overlain with that has been the very difficult reckonings that we've had as a society, as a country in the last 10 years, particularly since the murder of George Floyd, and the real angst that I think we as a society rightly feel for the civil rights violations that were highlighted in the course of those discussions, coupled with the COVID pandemic and all of the ensuing injustice that we saw. A social scientist whose name escapes me would always say that pandemics pandemics fracture societies along known fault lines. So when the pandemic occurred, all those fault lines further fractured society and exposed to all of us injustices that I think had been in the background, had always existed, but hadn't been top of mind. And I think what that meant for philanthropy is that a lot of well-intentioned, significant giving entered the space in an effort to remedy that problem. Now, those of us who work in philanthropy know that nothing changes in a day, nothing changes in a year, nothing changes in 5 years, and so it's hard. It's hard work. But the infusion of that capital, I do think, somehow changed the narrative. In some instances, that spirit was co-opted into ideological warfare. And I think that was an unfortunate and I think unintended consequence of what what we will now broadly call polarization in the last 10 years or so. But I think on the philanthropy side, that's sort of what I see, that there's been this struggle because ideology has suddenly become, to some, extremely prominent. We're in an election year where I think that a lot of philanthropic capital is driven. And it's not pejorative to say it's ideology, because you, as a philanthropist, you give your money to whatever you believe in, but it is not necessarily not dispassionate, quite passionate, right? So that's another way of giving, and I'm not criticizing it, but it is just very different than how we operate. So that's on the philanthropy side. I think on the policy making side, I think the point that I'll make is, there is no dearth of examples of polarization leading to dysfunction in legislation. I mean, we could just fire them off. In terms of even recent history in the last 6 months, 2 months, right? Of we're all collectively very frustrated at the lack of collaboration between parties. That is true, but it is also true. And we very deeply believe at Arnold Ventures, and have experienced it to be true, that there are areas, even at the federal level, and certainly at the state level, where people coalesce around issues that are important, that are of immediate salience to communities, and that people want to change today. And that those issues relate to healthcare, to taxation, to criminal justice, to public finance, to democracy, to all of these instances. So there is a lot of consensus. And we've even seen this at the federal level, right? We've seen this on surprise billing. We've seen this on, on healthcare. We've seen this on pharmaceutical pricing. We've seen it on criminal justice, most recently, the Prison Reform Act. So we've seen it in many, many, many areas where, despite the optics, which I grant you are not good, there is a lot of great work that is still happening and that could happen. And that's what gives me a lot of hope.
Great. And I'd like to talk about some of the progress that you are making in some of these areas. And given that it's election season, let me pick out one of the examples of a solution that Arnold Ventures is trying to advance with this idea that it leads to bipartisanness and brings everyone together and everyone into the process. One of the ideas that you've been advocating is called ranked choice voting. And I was wondering if you could explain what that is and talk about why that's an antidote to some of the polarization that we see.
Absolutely. And I'll say that, ranked choice voting, of course, is part of our democracy portfolio. The objective of that portfolio is not unlike the objective of any of our portfolios, which is to create systemic change in an area where we believe there's a market imbalance and suboptimal outcomes for society. So in democracy, in structural democracy reform, which is where we work, we see that broadly defined, the people who are elected do not necessarily, and sometimes omit necessarily, do not reflect the viewpoints of the people that they're representing. So there's this disconnect between the sentiments and views of the general population, or even the district that this person is representing, and the actions of that person, in his or her elected role. And now, why is that? There's lots of different reasons why one might believe that that exists. Our belief is that a very significant reason for that misalignment is our partisan primary system. So we have partisan primaries in most states. The game is won and lost in the primaries. The Texas Tribune here in my home state of Texas very famously reported not too long ago that something like 3% of Texans decide the electoral outcomes for the rest of the state, and that's because those are the people who show up in primaries. Um, most races, most primary races, or most races, I should say, are not competitive races, right? When you get to the D versus the R, because because the districts are such, and gerrymandering may be a reason, but for whatever reason, the districts as they are not competitive. The competitive piece is the primary. So winning the primary means you won the race. So if such a small number of people are determining this very, very important outcome, and those people are almost by definition not representative of the collective body of humans who are being represented by this person, then that is a disconnect. So our solution to this is to open the primaries, not have partisan primaries, but have one primary where the top, call it 4 people, make it to the general election, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, whatever they are. So piece one of the solution is open the primary system so that we can break this logjam of hyper-partisan primaries that are then determining the district. Part two of our proposed solution is, as you noted, ranked choice voting. So once you get to the election, you don't just vote for one person. You rank people. You rank your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, fourth choice, however many you'd like. And what that does is, I'll just say just in terms of process, then what happens is the votes are tallied. If somebody gets 50%, 51% of the vote, great, that person won. If a candidate does not get 51% of the vote, then your vote, you, Stacy, if you voted, for a number one, number two, number three, and your number one didn't win, then your vote doesn't get cast away. What happens is your number two choice becomes your number one choice, and the election gets run again until somebody becomes the 51% or 50.1% or whatever the applicable threshold is, winner. And then you have a winner. So what that does in practice is it signals to the candidates that I don't need to only cater to the people who are in my little bailiwick, who are my people. I need to cater to a much broader set of individuals because I want to be somebody's number two choice. And I want to be somebody's number three choice necessarily. I don't want to just be the number one choice of this tiny amount of people. I want to be those people's number one choice, but I also want to be like a lot of people's number two and number three choices. And that, when you do that, when you start looking with interest to a voter who is a little bit outside of your very narrow comfort zone, ideologically or politically or whatever else, then you change as a candidate because you become more centrist. You then become more reflective of the people that you would ultimately be serving. That is the hope. So you saw this in practice very, very clearly in the now not so recent, but not ancient election for New York City mayor, where ranked choice voting was implemented. And you saw candidates stumping together saying, vote for me. Vote for me, but you know what? If you don't want to vote for me, vote for Stacy. Right? Like, be clear. To be clear, I want you to vote for me. But, if you hate me or whatever, please vote for Stacy because she's the next best thing, right? And Stacy's saying the same thing, right? Saying vote for me, but if you're not gonna vote for me, vote for or vote for her number two, right? Vote for me number one, vote for her number two, right? So that shows you that then you're able to cater. to a different type of voter, and you become a different type of candidate. So that's what we're testing, and we're very, very optimistic about the intervention. This is in place now in Alaska. We're defending it, but I mean, there are ballot initiatives in Oregon and Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, South Dakota, lots and lots and lots of places where this is active and where there's great interest and momentum, because people understand that this disconnect doesn't help democracy. And it's not about helping Republicans or helping Democrats or helping independents or whatever else. It's simply about closing this gap of this disconnect between how a legislator acts and how her constituents feel.
It's such a good example of all the ingredients that need to go into some of the fixes that will make people want to engage in voting and indeed participate. I was wondering if you could zoom out a little bit and talk then about what is it, if philanthropists are trying to advance bipartisan solutions, are there 2 or 3 key ingredients you'd recommend that they keep in mind?
I think by far, for us, in our experience, the 2 most significant ingredients or factors that have allowed us to achieve, the success that we have, or the advance the projects that we believe we've been able to advance, has been first a focus on evidence, and second a lack of ideology. And by that, I don't mean a lack of passion. I mean a lack of ideology. I mean a lack of righteousness. So the first component, the evidence piece, I think we approach everything that we do with the lens of the first question we ask ourselves once we've identified a problem is, okay, what do we know? Like, what do we know works? What do we know doesn't? Are there really smart people in the field that have ideas that they would like to test that they haven't been able to test, either because they haven't had the resources or because they haven't had the opportunity, they haven't had the political backing for whatever else, right? So can we create, first, can we get our head around what we know and what we don't know, which is even more important than what we do know, right? Because lots of times we don't know things, and so we need to test things. And then can we create a theory of change of things that we should test, that we can then scale, that can then translate into policy change. So a lot of the work, when you center the work and anchor it on facts, you have a very different conversation than if you walk into a room of a legislature and just start preaching to them about your beliefs, right? And not that those aren't important. Those are important because you're a human being and you're entitled to your beliefs. And if you're a philanthropist and you want to invest in those beliefs, I get that. But I think in terms of building bridges, when you present someone with a body of facts, even if it's something very controversial, then that is a stepping stone to a conversation that is more likely to be productive in our experience. So a focus on evidence, I think, for us is really critical. And then the other piece that I mentioned was sort of our dispassionate approach that lacks ideology. And that's very important to the fabric of Arnold Ventures. And that's because, it is very easy, and honestly, it's very hard to resist the temptation to be righteous sometimes, right? Because sometimes you feel so deeply about some issues that you can't possibly conceive that somebody could think differently than you, right? But in fact, the world is a big place, and the country is a big place, and there's, a lot of people in this country, and they do think differently than you because they have different experiences than you, and because they have a different vantage point than you, and because they have different lives than you. And if you don't make space to respect those points of view, and if you label those points of view in a way that's pejorative, you will lose the fight right then. Now, there is a strategy that some pursue, and I respect, of, like burn the bridge and just, you call people who they are and you protest and you just make your voice heard. I get that. I get that. And I mean, that's sort of, I'm a fiery Latin. I'm Puerto Rican. I 100% get that. That is not how we work. but I think that it has to be very deliberate for us. If you're in the business of bipartisanship and collaboration, you have to mean it. And that means you've got to sit with people who don't think like you. And you've got to be okay with that. And you have to understand that that's how things happen. And they may not happen in exactly the way that that you would want, because if everybody were like us, well, the world would be just so perfect. But they're not, and we're not, and we're imperfect too. And so this is all an exercise in humility and in compassion and in getting to where we can get to, considering what we all care about.
I think those are terrific lessons for all of our audience. And also, I think everyone is incredibly appreciative of all the research that Arnold Ventures has funded. As you've often noted, there is not a lot of good research on many of the topics on which we think we know something, and at least starting that basis off of knowing things is helpful. And this probably plays into something we asked our audience what they would like to hear from you. And somebody wrote in and said, would love to hear Laura discuss some of the incredible impact that Arnold Ventures has had on the criminal justice system and what criminal justice, how it plays out in political partisanship based on the research. So would you like to give a quick few minutes on the criminal justice, just as an example of what you were talking about when we discussed research? That's another of those hot button issues that people disagree on in many cases, and yet you've been able to bring about a great deal of progress.
Well, I very much appreciate both the compliment and certainly the question. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this portfolio. This is one of our oldest portfolios, criminal justice. I mean, it's hard to believe, but when we entered the space, really there were very few philanthropists in criminal justice. I think there was a very active juvenile justice philanthropic space, because I think juveniles, always for justifiable reasons, I think have had a greater degree of attention, and it's a different it's a different environment, if you will. But I mean, when we entered the space, it is not much of an exaggeration to say that people mostly believed, the general population mostly believed that, well, if you were in prison, you did something bad, and I don't know, just that's where you belonged. And I mean, there wasn't a collective discourse about the system, right? There just wasn't. There were many dedicated, humble, incredible people trying to reform the system, and they were, it was like Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who, right? Like they were screaming and screaming and screaming, and there wasn't a whole lot of philanthropic attention, and therefore policy attention. Now, a couple of things happened that I think worked in our favor. So we entered the space. Very quickly, we became, not by virtue of anything like grand or great that we did, but because of, by virtue of the dearth of the space, we became the largest funder in criminal justice, overnight. Again, because that was not a hard that was not a hard obstacle, because there weren't that many people in the space. But we started just looking at the space and trying to figure out. I mean, there's so much broken in all of these systems, right? That sometimes you're kind of like playing whack-a-mole, and you think, well, is it going to be helpful to do this, and then something else is going to pop up? And there are so many. Everything is broken, right? Like nobody in criminal justice is going to tell you, or maybe like one or two people might tell you, oh, this one thing is, works perfectly, right? I mean, there are prisons in this country that work extremely well and better than others. There are singular actors who are actually quite good, but no one is going to tell you, oh, this system we have, bravo, right? Nobody. Everything is bad, right? And by the way, it doesn't relate only to the carceral system. It relates to everything, right? It relates to society. It relates to the circumstances in which we create, that creates a pipeline to prison. It relates to how we treat people once they exit prison, right? So it's a whole thing. Anyway, so this is all to say that when we started, there was much less consciousness of all of that. Not to mention, the whole issues regarding policing and everything else. So we started our work in criminal justice with a very simple observation. We looked at the pretrial system, and we saw that in most jurisdictions, when you get arrested for whatever, like you get arrested for, anything, shoplifting or DUI or whatever else, you get put in front of a judge. And that judge generally at the time would just look at a fixed bail schedule and would say, okay, this is, okay, Stacy Palmer, okay, first offense, second offense, okay, bail is set at, $500, bam, I'll see you, okay, today is September 4th, okay, I'll see you April 26th, right, for your trial. I'll see you, and, so what happens to Stacy between September 4th and April 26th? Well, that depends on one thing only. One thing. Does Stacy have $500, which is the bail amount? That's it. If Stacy has $500 or she has $50 to pay 10% to a bail bondsman, she goes home and she may or may not appear, on April 26th. If Stacy doesn't have $500, she stays in jail. She stays in jail, incarcerated, until her trial, even though we live in a system where you are innocent until proven guilty, allegedly, right? So we took a step back, and that seemed really stupid to us for lots of reasons, right? It seemed expensive, right? And it seemed like, the thing you should care about when Stacy is in front of that judge, the only things that you should care about are, number one, is Stacy going to show up in court in April? Is she going to show up, or is she going to flee and we're never going to see her again? And second, is she violent? Is she going to do something bad to somebody if we release her? That's it. A fixed bail schedule answers neither of those questions, because organized crime pays the money right away and walks, right? Whereas somebody who shoplifted from Target and, because she has to feed her 3 kids, that doesn't answer any questions. And so this started, and I'll shortcut a lot, but anyway, this started our interest in, can we create a more data-centric system to create a better outcome? And that coincided with a lot of budget crises in state governments where people were asking, why are we spending all this money incarcerating people? Do they need to be there in the first place? And so that was our first foray into criminal justice reform, is having these conversations about who needs to be in prison, who needs to be in jail, under what circumstances. And what we've learned since then, in the many years since then, is that initial carceral event has highly detrimental consequences for your entire life. So if we can delay that moment of incarceration, that's good for society. It saves society money. It doesn't destroy lives. It creates better outcomes for communities, right? So I guess this is not a short answer, but I'll try to make it a short answer. In terms of our criminal justice work, what we're focused now, and I think what we learned from that experience, is that the focus of our criminal justice work and of the system needs to be to create an environment where there are consequences for bad actions, where we are serving people who need assistance, and sometimes, very frequently, a carceral environment is not the solution, and in fact, it exacerbates the problem. And that we do it in a way that is respectful of civil rights and public safety, right? So how can we create a system that balances those things: public safety, civil rights, what's right for society, public accountability? So that's that's the body of our research, and that's what we're thinking about all the time: is what interventions create better outcomes for people? What police trainings create better outcomes so that we have fewer incidents of abuse? What kinds of interventions in prisons create better outcomes, both for prisoners and for security guards, for prison guards? What creates a higher likelihood of success? Because that's what we care about as a society, right? Having successful people come out of the carceral system not broken, but in a position to be productive members of society. So there's lots of tentacles to the criminal justice work that are research focused, that we've really gotten really deep on. Community corrections is another one that is, I think, highly bipartisan, highly impactful. Something like 4 million people are under community supervision in this country, probation and parole. The conditions are onerous and often nonsensical. There's tons of opportunity and tons of bipartisan opportunity to change that, to help people become agents of change, to help people develop better lives as opposed to crushing them and and creating worse outcomes for everyone.
And I like how focused on the goals that you have are, and they're audacious and ones that you're going to need to keep at for a long time. And that's the other part of how you've described this work. There are no short-term fixes, and that is what philanthropy is here for. As we close today, we talked a little bit about how these divides in society are changing how philanthropy works and what's possible. When you look forward, are you seeing changes that you think more people will come together in bipartisan solutions in the world of philanthropy? And are there philanthropists that you're looking at that you're especially excited to see the kind of work that they're doing?
I think there's lots and lots of people who are extraordinarily passionate about the things they do. I think sort of from a topical perspective, we have great collaborations and are very attuned to many philanthropists who share our values, and things like infrastructure and energy, which we didn't talk too much about. Certainly democracy, journalism, criminal justice, etc. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of momentum and a heightened awareness of evidence. So I think that the challenge is to get everybody, I would say, to develop a consensus of what evidence means, right? That probably more than anybody because of your role, that every nonprofit that you will ever see will show you a graph that has a hockey stick, right? That says, well, we started here and now we're here, so look how amazing we are, right? And that's not evidence, right? That's not science. And we and by the way, those people who come before you, they're amazing people. They're wonderful people. They've devoted their lives to this thing that they deeply believe in. And they've got tons of anecdotal evidence as to why this is the thing to do. But if there's no science, there's no science. And by the way, and I personally don't have a problem with funding something where there's no science. If you say, this is an experiment, there's no science, and we're going to test it, right? I think that's a perfectly acceptable, admirable, great thing to do. I think where we get into problems as philanthropists is when we're calling evidence something that is not evidence. And we get criticized a lot, to be honest, at Arnold Ventures for that, because that's not a popular stance to take, right? To tell somebody who is a wonderful, just kind, amazing person that their thing is unproven. We're not saying their thing doesn't work. I mean, sometimes I guess maybe we're saying their thing doesn't work, but frequently all we're saying is we have no idea whether your thing works. So we would like to test it. That's it. And so I think having that discipline is my aspiration, I think, for the next stage of collaboration in philanthropy, especially as we tackle some of these issues that are long-term, because every program that we implement from a policy level that we don't test is a missed opportunity, because these problems are going to come back. And if we spend massive amounts of federal resources and don't learn, what are we doing? Who are we helping? And the last thing that we always say around here, or at least I always say, is that as intuitive as it sounds, things that don't work don't help people. It's as simple as that. So if you are in this work because you want to help people, then you need to be invested in knowing what doesn't work. Because otherwise you're doing something else, but you're not helping people. You're developing your brand, you're patting people on the back or whatever, but you're not helping people. So if you really if you care, then you have to care about this issue.
Thank you for that. That's excellent advice. And I think we all want to come back and talk to you about how you're able to advance that view, because you're right. Not everybody in philanthropy necessarily follows it, but we are seeing more evidence of that. And one of the reasons the Chronicle does its work, obviously, is to make sure that philanthropists are accountable and we are asking what's working and that we're candid and honest about what's not. So I appreciate all of the elements of this conversation and all of the work that Laura, you and your colleagues at Arnold Ventures do all day. I thank our audience for listening to this terrific conversation. This is the first part of a series. We'll be doing many more. You can always follow us on the Commons at philanthropy.com. Just look at the link in our homepage and you'll be able to follow everything new that we've published, plus newsletters and more. So we thank you all and hope that everyone has a great rest of your day. Laura, thanks again so much for joining us.
Stacy, thank you so much for the opportunity. And again, I'm so grateful for your convening power and for your use of your convening power for these conversations. Thank you all very much.
What a terrific conversation with Laura Arnold, and we have lots more in store. I'm very excited about a forthcoming conversation with Lila Zidane of Future Caucus. That's coming September 18th. And then on October 2nd, we'll be joined by Eric Bork, who is a Hollywood producer who is really bringing this idea of closing divides and what society can do to the movie screen with a rom-com. You'll want to hear both of these conversations and so much more that we have in store. So please be sure to join us at the Commons and let us know what other speakers you'd like to hear from and what you'd like to hear from our guests. Thank you so much for joining us.